Don't like an overprotective mother who abuses her children, or a drunken rapist who leaves his kids in fighting pits? Here's why you should support them. Besides both sides of the coin being fairly problematic, you have to sway at least to one side or the other when it comes to who should rule or not. While I'm not saying the Greens are morally correct or right even, this is why they're better than the Blacks. First of all, would Rhaenyra really be a better ruler than Aegon? I counted all of Rhaenyra's failures in this video, so check it out after if you're interested. But basically, she's a liar, kills people, and is pretty manipulative. While yes, Aegon is just as bad, if not worse, he has the counsel of Otto and Alicent. While Otto is a tiring asshole that wants his kin to be on the throne, he does seem to take action based on the idea on what's better for the realm. He's also very diplomatic and courteous. And if we move over to Alicent, she's very dutiful, which is shown in her marriage and devotion to Viserys, and also her motivation towards the Sept and its ideals. Not to mention that she actually has a conscience and a sense of right and wrong, like when it at least somewhat looked like she was sympathetic towards the girl Aegon raped. So while yes, these two may do some questionable things in their personal lives, as extensions of rulers, they would be great for their sense of duty and diplomacy. You can extend this to Aegon, who doesn't even want to be king in the first place. You can easily just have Aegon become a figurehead and have Otto and Alicent become the rulers. This is actually shown in the show. When Viserys gets too sick to really function, the Hightowers essentially just rule for him. And it's not like the realm falls into chaos or anything. Even if Aegon doesn't want to just be a figurehead, he still is going to be influenced by these two nonetheless. Compare this to Rhae, who has Daemon by her side. He would likely constantly try to incite war and conflict and overall just give bad advice to her. Also, not to mention that Rhaenyra's decision would be heavily influenced by personal trauma and her emotions, much like Daemon himself. For example, at multiple points in the series, we see Rhaenyra making bad decisions after some emotional event happened, whether that's her having sex with Sir Christian or her presumably going to war after Luke's death. If people in Westeros see her ruling the throne, she could very well make dumb, irrational decisions based on the actions those people take to get her off of it. She's not methodical at all, and it becomes even worse for her in times of stress. This also isn't mentioning that Aemond is a hard worker when it comes to his training and studying, and Rice the biggest dragon, and Helena can tell the future with her dreams. Those are definitely two people I would want on my side while I'm ruling a kingdom. Another point is that Rhaenyra has no political skills at all, and it doesn't really seem like she knows what she's doing. In the show, we never see Viserys giving her any political training. Compare this to Otto, who seemed to be pretty seasoned in his understanding of how politics in this world works. For example, Rhaenyra leaves her royal progress early and doesn't go out and talk to the other lords. She just stays on Dragonstone, which definitely helped lead to so many people ditching their oaths they originally said for her. The Greens work for the approval they get from the lords in Westeros, not through oaths, but showing that they're the legitimately stronger house to side with. But if the Blacks were in power and a rebellion started, I'd be a lot less confident in them to quell it in a meaningful way. Yeah, they would have dragons, but like we've seen before, especially with Maegor the Cruel, just burning people and buildings down won't always just solve the problem, and it can actually be the start of multiple rebellions. Rhaenyra hasn't shown that she has any of the tools to handle disorder effectively, and the same goes for Daemon and her unproven children. Not to mention the chaos that can happen if her sons were to ever actually sit the throne. If Jace sat the Iron Throne, his legitimacy would always be in question. While yes, lying generally is wrong, and lying about having bastard children is probably wrong as well, planning to have one of them rule is worse. In Game of Thrones, people knew that Cersei had children that legally weren't fit to rule. Obviously, this helped start the War of the Five Kings, which isn't surprising. When you sit people on the throne that don't have a claim, then people will challenge it. Even in an ideal situation where the Greens just crowned Rhaenyra, people would claim her sons to be illegitimate, and this could start a war easily. In reality, there's multiple reasons as to why it's better for the greater good if Rhaenyra doesn't rule, besides her being a woman, which is one of the main arguments shown in the show. With her putting bastards on the throne, some people will also likely make the claim that her kids by Daemon are more legitimate. They're undoubtedly Targaryen. I mean, let's forget the Greens for a second. If Jace ever takes the throne, then there will always be people saying that Aegon the Younger has a better claim. This could easily start a civil war type of conflict. You're kind of setting your kids up for failure by doing this. In this light, does Rhaenyra really seem like a good ruler to you, or even a decent decision maker or mother? And yes, I realize Aegon has bastards as well, but the difference is that his bastards aren't lined up to be heir to the throne, thus making it less likely that a rebellion would happen. Whereas Rhaenyra is putting her obvious bastard child in direct line to rule, making it obvious for anyone to see that that he's not legitimate, which would cause conflict. While yes, Aegon is a drunken fool, he has the influence of two politically intelligent people who've already proved that they can rule a realm. And that's assuming that Aegon wouldn't want to just be a figurehead and delegate all the political stuff to the rest of his family anyway. All this is in service of the greater good argument, which I'm about to get into right now. A big problem with the it's for the greater good argument is that you have to ask that the ends justify the means. We know Aegon is a bad person, but so is Rhaenyra. Like I said, it's pretty unlikely that Aegon would be making too many decisions in his council anyway, so the outcome of his rule wouldn't even be relatively bad in the first place. Like I said earlier, I'll take these two making politically smart decisions over these two any day. Yeah, sure, Aegon would be making terrible personal decisions. That's not a reason why the Greens shouldn't be in power. Just because he's a bad person doesn't mean his whole reign would be a bad one. This way we can have our cake and eat it too, because it's more likely that war wouldn't happen under the Greens or civil unrest because Aegon is a man and he doesn't have bastard children that he's lining straight up for the throne. In terms of ethically speaking, why shouldn't we prioritize the lives of the majority, or consequences lead to the least harm being caused? In any case, I don't know how you can't side with the Greens here. Besides, it's extremely morally questionable to put millions of people's lives at stake because of a lie that only benefits yourself, which is what Rhae is doing. Why would you want that person to be your ruler of a kingdom? So while yes, both of these people don't deserve it, I think it's pretty clear on what side should rule. I also like to address the argument that Aegon is a usurper. I mean, why should anyone follow the word of a dead king, especially when his judgment wasn't the best? Sure, Viserys claimed Rhaenyra be the heir to the throne, but okay, he did and said a lot of questionable things. Why should we honor what he said this time? Was Robert considered a usurper? Sure, but who cares? If I lived in that world and someone took power from Aerys, I'd be extremely happy, especially if it was Robert. And him usurping the throne is definitely beneficial for the realm, so what's the point of even bringing it up? Usurping doesn't change how good or bad your role is or will be, and the Iron Throne doesn't belong to anyone. People just take the throne when they have enough power and people accept the fact. If Lannisters magically got bigger, better dragons, they would take the throne instantly. You wouldn't hear them saying it's wrong because the Targaryens have the right to rule that doesn't exist. Applying this to Aegon doesn't work for the reasons stated before. Like this video? Check these out. See ya.
Should these guys rule over Westeros? Quick answer is yes. Want to hear the reasons why you agree with me? Rhaenyra is the main character, so naturally we're gonna root for her, but she does have the best arguments for the throne in the show. Reason number one being is that her moral character is better than anyone else on the Greens. It's bad enough being a drunken rapist, but it's even worse to advocate for a drunken rapist to have absolute power, and you could apply this to everyone else on the Green side. While Rhaenyra does have her faults, she's still not on the same level as Aegon, and yes, she lies about her kids and kills an innocent man to fake Laenor's death. That isn't as bad as rape and pointlessly leaving your bastard kid in a fighting pit. At least Rhaenyra's bad actions have a purpose behind it, and you can even argue that they're necessary evils that spawn some form of good. For instance, if she didn't lie about her kids being bastards, I can see that Jace, Luke, and Joffrey's lives would be way worse. And in the case of the innocent man Daemon and Rhae killed, at least they gave Laenor the life that he wanted. When Aegon does bad things, they only benefit Aegon, and they hold no other purpose, which makes his actions even less understandable and worse. Giving a man like that any chance for power would be a bad idea. He wasn't even king yet, and he was still shown abusing it. Aegon was raised by Alicent to be an heir to the throne and treated as such, which probably contributed to him being spoiled. Compare that to Rhae, who was never really raised to be an heir, and some of her behavior seems to be better because of it, at least when you compare it to Aegon. You would think that Alicent would give Aegon some form of political training, but it's obvious that Aegon doesn't have any, which puts him and Rhaenyra pretty much in the same boat when it comes to that aspect. This does show off Alicent's parenting skills though. Look how Alicent's kids come out compared to Rhaenyra's. We'll get deeper into that in a moment. It would also be good to mention who would be empowered by extension of Aegon ruling. People like Jace, Luke, Corlys, Rhaenys, and Daemon even are much better people than Alicent, Otto, Aegon, and Aemond. Imagine what could happen if the Greens won the throne. Guys like Sir Christian could do pretty much whatever they want, and this would be fairly problematic. The problem is once you advocate for one person on the Greens, you advocate for the rest of them, and it's pretty hard to say that there would be less problems if they did rule. The most chaotic person on Team Black is Daemon, obviously, and even he has calmed down a lot since the start of the season. He's still crazy, but you get the point. This is pretty important since these characters will either be in power somewhere or will gain power by their respective side ruling, so let's compare them. Alright, well, let's compare the two worst people on each list. This is probably going to be between Daemon and Sir Christian. I covered Daemon in my first video, but he essentially kills his wife, some peasant dudes along with dismembering them, this random dude so he can marry Rhaenyra, and he almost fucks his niece to get back at his brother. Sir Christian currently has only killed Joffrey and Lord Beesbury. While you could argue that Sir Christian's worse as of now, or at the very least, extremely unhinged, Daemon has just more of a track record of doing bad things even though he's calmed down a bit, so I'll give it to Sir Christian. Now let's compare Rhaenyra's kids to Alicent's. This is obviously no contest, by the way. Joffrey, Luke, and Jace are presented as the most wholesome characters in the show, and they seem like the most normal people. Compare that to Aegon and Aemond, who would most likely be in jail if you put them into the real world, and we obviously have our winners. Luke isn't power hungry at all, and he constantly humbles himself, and Jace actually prepares to be king, unlike a certain somebody. While Aemon is a hard worker and knows his stuff, the fact that he was so irresponsible that he would chase his nephew on Vhagar is beyond me. This pretty much put him in villain territory for a lot of people. Aegon didn't seem all that bad at first. He just seemed like a weirdo at worst who didn't have his priorities straight, but then he raped someone, and that's pretty much how you know that the show doesn't really want you to like this guy anymore if you ever did in the first place.
This one's going to the blacks.
Joffrey essentially is too young to even have a personality yet, and Alicent's third kid, who will be revealed in season 2, Daemon, obviously hasn't been shown. And oh yeah, somehow I forgot Helena. Yeah, she's fine. Weird, obviously, but she doesn't do anything wrong. But this isn't really enough to offset the actions of Aegon and Aemond. Next is Corlys and Rhaenys versus Otto. While yes, I can agree, at the very least he's deceitful, obviously. Even worse than that is the fact that he was more than willing to kill a whole family, children included, to end the conflict that he engineered in the first place. And on top of that, there really isn't any indication that he wants what's best for the realm. While yes, he may say in some instances, I highly doubt that the greater good was his reasoning for having Alicent marry Viserys and creating this overall greater conflict between the two families. It's more likely he just wanted his kids to be on the throne, and now he's doing some pretty questionable things to achieve that. Now, Corlys and Rhaenys aren't that bad at all. The most questionable thing Rhaenys did or didn't do was burn the Greens alive. This one action could have ended the war right there, but I'm not gonna act like this is as bad as creating the war in the first place. And Corlys is pretty chill. He doesn't really do anything problematic, at least relative to the other people in the show. I mean, he even helps liberate the Stepstones and allows Luke to be Lord of Driftmark, which is pretty nice of him. So another win for the blacks. So the last round is between Rhaenyra and Alicent. To be completely honest with you, I'm not sure which one's worse really. When it comes to my real opinion, not just an argument, I find it kind of hard to compare them. For instance, most of Alicent's actions are because she's brainwashed essentially. She genuinely believes that Rhaenyra will kill her children because that's what Otto told her, and the men manipulating her life seemingly have warped her beliefs. One of the reasons as to why Alicent hates Rhae is because she thinks she has no sense of duty. Rhae has flings with multiple other men, and that doesn't fit into Alicent's idea of duty, so she resents her for it and treats her like a degenerate. Mind you that the only reason Alicent thinks this way is because Otto and Viserys have obviously instilled the idea that being loyal to one man is a woman's only purpose in life, and also that it's the right thing to do no matter what the circumstances. So it's no surprise when she hates Rhaenyra or is resentful to her when these imaginary rules in her head are broken. Not to mention that Alicent also is likely subscribing to the idea that only a man can rule anyway, which she is likely getting from Otto and her lifelong servitude of men. But while I can see where Alicent's coming from and her thought process, this doesn't make her actions okay or less consequential. In the end, she should be able to check her biases since she's a grown woman and she still helps lead Westeros into war. And while Rhaenyra obviously isn't a saint, she doesn't start conflict. While yes, she definitely could have made some better decisions to avoid said conflict, it's still not her fault. A lot of Rhaenyra's motivations can be boiled down to she just wants her birthright, which isn't inherently bad. The only criticism I have is that she's setting her kids up for a succession crisis, because Jace is a bastard and her other kids by Daemon aren't bastards and have more Targaryen blood. But this isn't guaranteed to start a war, at least not as much as Otto and Alicent crowning Aegon behind Rhaenyra's back. So I'm going to give it to her. So unsurprisingly, the blacks would have morally better people in power, which will likely lead to better outcomes. But do you know what else could lead to better outcomes? Today's spawns? Yeah, I'm showing this video doesn't have one, except for myself. So it would be appreciated if you liked and subscribed if you like this type of content. I would definitely be making more in the future. So back to the video. As I was saying, the blacks have better people, so therefore better outcomes. Pretty simple, right? But there's another factor that I really haven't talked much about in my other videos. A big problem for the Greens is that one of their main arguments is that Rhaenyra is a woman. And while it feels icky to hear a character use that as their justification, you might at first think that makes a little bit of sense, at least in this world. You wouldn't want war so a woman can't be in power. It would just cause too much conflict. This justification for things feels wrong for a reason, and it signifies the Greens' overall moral character. While yes, they're correct in the idea that having a woman rule would be controversial and possibly violent, this goes against our intuitions about what's right versus wrong. If you lived in the 1960s, would you say that's wrong to protest for civil rights because it could create division and violence? We would oppose anyone who would use that justification because we know know oppression, at least on the basis of race, sex, and gender, to be worse than short-term violence or opposition. Yes, generally violence is bad, but if you need violence or division to overcome some form of oppression, it's usually seen as okay, at least in the short term, because the benefits of having breakthroughs and rights for the different types of people is usually more beneficial. Maybe the people of Westeros might revolt in war because she's a woman, but the breakthrough for women would outweigh the bad in this scenario most likely. Besides, we shouldn't accommodate for racist or sexist beliefs anyway. We shouldn't not allow a group of people to do something just because a different group of people will get upset about it because of that person's sex. If you're sexist, then that's on you, not the other person. And I feel like that's one of the main reasons why the Greens are framed in this negative light in the show, which is obviously for good reason. It just doesn't feel right to root for them even if you can't put your finger on it. If you like this video, then you'll definitely like my other ones. I've referenced these older videos a lot, so if you want the full scope of this one, I would suggest watching those as well. I publish roughly around once a week, so I'll definitely be taking some suggestions about reviews or breakdowns. Alright, see ya.
I'm going to address plus argue for and against every controversial opinion in House of the Dragon. This is part 1. Like if you want to see part 2. First controversial take is Daemon choking Rhaenyra is out of character. A big reason why this is controversial is because people at this point felt an emotional connection for Daemon, and seeing his character do something like domestic abuse probably set them off a bit. There's a line between what people think is acceptable for protagonistic characters to be able to do. For example, some people were shocked when Arya had sex in season 8, and a lot of people claimed it felt wrong because they saw her grow up as a little girl. But when she bakes a man's son into a pie and has him eat it, no one really complains and they seem to be pretty desensitized to it. You can argue the same thing is happening to Daemon here. He can kill as many people as possible, but when he chokes Rhaenyra, controversy is sparked. This isn't me belittling domestic abuse or saying what Daemon did was okay, but it's interesting to note the dynamics between killing and how we feel about our characters and why that is. Daemon had killed his other wife literally earlier that season. Is it that far-fetched to say he would choke Rhaenyra? A big character point for Daemon is that when he gets mad, he commits violent acts, even to loved ones. For instance, he kills Vaemond without thinking, beats a messenger, and mutilates a whole bunch of peasants because of his sense of justice. At the bare minimum, this indicates that he's extremely impulsive. You also have to factor in that Daemon loved his brother in Targaryen history, so him not knowing Aegon's prophecy and Rhaenyra shoving this in his face would definitely have set him off since Viserys decided to never tell him. And when you consider that, this seems less like a petty dispute and more like something he genuinely should be mad about. Post-time skip Daemon is extremely calm compared to pre-time skip, which makes good sense. He has a whole family now, and he spends his time reading instead of fighting in wars. Of course he goes back to King's Landing, but he doesn't really do anything brash. Although he cuts off Vaemond's head, you could argue this was justified and logical to do so, because Vaemond not only questioned and insulted his wife in front of him, but he also challenged Luke, who's obviously on Daemon's side. Vaemond would be a pawn for the Greens, and him being kept alive could cause problems down the line, so killing him here would be pretty smart, especially since Daemon would have reason to do so, since Vaemond just broke the law and called race kids bastards. This simply just isn't the same Daemon we saw earlier in the season, and that's supported even more at the War Council. While yes, he's more willing to go to war when you compare him to Rhaenyra, he's very strategical and not impulsive, showing his experience in Substones. With this calmer and more experienced Daemon comes the fact that he genuinely seems to care about Rhaenyra. It's been a lot of time bonding, and this was the woman that gave him heirs. He has been shown to go to great lengths for it, and while he did kill Lady Rhea, he was never shown physically abusing Laena, and he could even make a decision on giving her a C-section even though that would give him another child. So it would be out of character for him to hurt his new wife in this way after we've seen him grow so much. An executive producer even said it was a surprise for his character. It's a moment I think it's surprising and shocking for Daemon as a character, but I also think it's one of those things that's been set up over the course of the entire season. So while yes, it was set up for the whole season, you can still argue that it doesn't make sense for Daemon to do this. I've seen some speculation of this online, and I definitely would love to give my 2 cents. There's definitely some discussion around nature versus nurture here, and how the show presents Aegon with very little screen time, which seems to indicate that he's an antagonist. But some people have defended him, which makes this an interesting topic to cover. I would also like to know that someone can be a victim and a villain. They're not mutually exclusive. In this case, we're seeing if he's more of a villain or more of a victim. Let's see which argument holds up. Aegon has obviously been abused by his parents, both mentally and physically. Viserys pretty much forgets he exists because he is his heir, and Alicent abuses him in multiple ways. Aegon literally has to ask Alicent if she loves him, to which she calls him an idiot. She also tells Aegon that it's okay to bully Aemond in private, but not in public. His behavior isn't productive in raising a child, and when you compare Alicent's children to Rhaenyra's, it makes sense. Because of these things, you could argue that Aegon is simply just a product of his environment. While yes, Aegon has better than 99.9% of people in Westeros, when you mix abusive parenting with people telling you you're more important than everyone else, and the promise of absolute power, then how do you expect a person to come out? You would also have to consider that we're comparing Aegon to our current moral standards. Everything Aegon does is bad, but you could argue that wasn't considered wrong in this universe, which could possibly give him some moral leeway when you consider the intent of his actions. If you never thought what he was doing was all that bad, then can you still morally condemn him? Not to mention that other kings like Robert were drunkards and rapists as well, but many wouldn't consider him to be as bad as Aegon. While Alicent and Viserys being abusive explains the way Aegon is, it's just that, an explanation. It doesn't make him any less of a villain or his actions any better. There have been many instances of rulers who were in bad situations, but they didn't turn out as bad as Aegon. Sure, you can argue that people are simply just results of their circumstances, but that has no effect on how good of a person they are. Aegon is still a terrible person either way you cut it, even by that universe's standards. Him leaving his bastard kid in a fighting pit makes him worse for even the low standards in that world. Not only is he supporting child fighting, but leaving his own child there, which is also a bastard, is overwhelmingly bad when you add on everything else he's done. Alicent is a villain. So the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is if Alicent is a villain herself. While this is quite similar to Aegon's case, it has other nuances I would like to touch on. First, I'm going to explain why this case is different than Aegon's. Alicent doesn't do anything explicitly as bad as Aegon, like rape or leave her kids in fighting pits. Although she is abusive, Aegon's actions are motivated primarily by self-indulgence, whereas Alicent seems to have a higher purpose, whether that be the Seven or what she genuinely thinks is good for the realm or her children. All this should be considered when comparing the two. Alicent isn't a villain because the scope of her actions contribute to a good cause. In my Team Green video, I outlined that the Greens were fighting for the greater good, which includes Alicent, and often we see her stopping Otto from going to war and doing things that are unnecessary, which is why there was a race to find Aegon in the first place. This implies that Alicent isn't being malicious, and she genuinely thinks that Rhaenyra would be bad for the realm. This isn't indicative of villain behavior at all. Otto would be more appropriate of being a villain here than anything. Rhae Rowling has multiple problems, including her succession line being set up awkwardly, to the people of Westeros not accepting her, which is further outlined in my video here. All this means is that Alicent's motives are within reason and well-intentioned to protect the people and her children. This is even factoring in that she was manipulated by Otto, Viserys, and Larys. This manipulation to serve has obviously warped her worldview, and you could argue that her resulting actions aren't really on her, but more on the people manipulating her. Much like her son, the problems with Alicent is that she should be able to discern her actions from right and wrong. For example, you can argue that anyone who knowingly supports a drunk and a rapist to gain absolute power is in the wrong no matter what the circumstances are. You could apply this argument to everyone else on the green side, but what makes it even worse for Alicent is that she's a big reason why Aegon is this bad in the first place, but yet she does nothing to make him a better ruler or improve his mental state, while knowing that he's a rapist. Instead, she just devotes all of her time and energy into just getting him on the throne. Even if she has intentions, these acts in themselves are pretty reprehensible, especially when you consider that the alternative choice for Aegon ruling isn't even that bad at worst, and at best, Rhaenyra is blatantly a better outcome than Aegon, making Alicent's whole cause for a rapist pretty pointless. Not to mention that she silences Diana even though she knows it's wrong, and the fact that she's a terrible parent, which we covered in the last section, makes all of this a lot worse. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like. In the meantime, watch this one. See you. In this video, we're going to talk about Aemond Targaryen and what makes this character work. Let's get into it. The root of why people like this character so much is essentially because he's cool. He has an eye patch and he's really good at sword fighting. And he also has a really big dragon. But these things alone aren't really what makes him a cool character. For any character being appreciated this way, they have to have a reason to be cool. For example, if you're reading or watching a story and a dude with an eye patch and a sword randomly walks into a scene, you're probably going to think that he just looks goofy. We've all seen attempts at media trying to make cool characters and feeling badly when they're trying to throw in cool aspects about something without doing the legwork to properly set that up. Think about Euron for Game of Thrones. He has an eye patch and he's good with swords, but instead of a huge dragon, he has a massive fleet of ships that he by himself commands. This character should be extremely cool, but he's not at all. He's the goofy stereotype that we were talking about before. Of course, in A Song of Ice and Fire, it makes complete sense for Euron to have all of these things, but without the context, the show just plops him in as a side character without much backstory or the crucial character motivation motivation that makes Euron good. But this isn't a Euron video. How this relates to Aemon is that the very aspect of his cool factor is explained and earned by his own merits. Yeah, he wears an eye patch, but he got it from taming the biggest dragon in the world. Yeah, he's really good at swords, but he practiced for years to get to that level. Yeah, he rides the biggest dragon, but he mustered up enough courage to ride it because of his siblings bullying him. Every positive trait Aemon has, he's had to work hard for, which puts him on a completely different playing field than someone like Aegon, for instance, which is almost nobody's favorite character in the show, even though he has more importance. Imagine if Aemon got no backstory and they just introduced him in episode 6 for the first time. You would think this dude is probably dumb looking, and when you see him beat Sir Christian, you would probably just roll your eyes. So I can't emphasize this part enough. Some more examples of this are Mary and Gary Stu-like characters, who could just do anything from the jump seemingly with no explanation or at the expense of the plot or story. Characters like these are boring because they have no stakes or humanity. The last part for this point that I want to bring up is that Aemon's still vulnerable, which he obviously should be. And I don't mean in an emotional sense, but for instance, he backs down to Daemon. So while Aemon's extremely skilled and strong, it shows that he's still smart, but most importantly that he looks up to people as well. Having a cool character like Aemon look up to someone else is extremely humanizing. Like, yeah, even a dude like this can have a role model. I mean, it's true, we all have someone we look up to. There's more evidence to this when Daemon cuts off Aemon's head. Aemon in this scene kind of looks like he's in awe, like Daemon's ruthlessness seems to be extremely impressive to Aemon. But more about the vulnerable side of this character. It's likely that Aegon abused Aemon in some other way than what we've seen on the show. For instance, when him and Sir Christian are looking for Aegon, they go to a brothel, and Aemon says that Aegon brought him there for his first sexual experience. And knowing Aegon's messed up thought process, we can only imagine the other things he put his brother through before Aemon started training. And this puts into context Aemon's underdog mentality. He's bullied by his siblings, even Jace, which is crazy because a lot of people considered him a bastard. Aemon was even born half the size of Aegon, so by all measures, he is an underdog, which seems to fuel his motivations. But this is a perfect moment to get into why he's a good villain for the show. So while the Greens aren't explicit antagonists, I guess, let's be honest, they're definitely framed as villains at the very least. Aemon fits this mold perfectly. I've said this before in other videos as well, but the best villains are the ones that are understandable. Don't get me wrong, there are villains that are straight up evil for evil's sakes, and they're fun. But more times than not, the good villains are the most understandable. Aemon fits snugly into this category. We can see his motivation for getting stronger and even wanting to bully other people since he is bullied himself. We may not agree with it, but you could definitely see where he's coming from. At first, Aemon is completely warranted in wanting to gain power, but he takes this way too far after he kills Luke. See, before this point, I don't think you can even consider Aemon to be a villain even though he's on side green. It makes perfect sense for him to defend his side of the house, and he was even a victim earlier. But as soon as he uses Vhagar to intimidate Luke, the dynamic obviously changes. These are the best villains, because at one point you agree with them, their logic and reasoning is justified and their actions match that. But at some point they take that logic too far and end up doing something bad because of it. This can be seen with Killmonger, Vader, Thanos. I'm not saying that Aemon is on par with these characters as villains, but the path the show takes to get him to that despicable point is the same. His logic is that he was bullied, so therefore he had to gain power and exert it. But he kept exerting his power even when everyone in the damn room knew how strong he was. He's obviously compensating. This would be like your friend going bald and then buying a sports car, but he never shuts up about it. And there's even more proof of this. In the dining room scene, a pig gets set down on the table for the meal. Luke looks at him and giggles, which is obviously referring to the pink dread joke of Aemon having a pig instead of a dragon. Aemon seems to genuinely get mad at this, at least to some capacity. But why would he care? He has the biggest dragon in the world, and he's the second most dangerous person in that room. So why does he care about a 6-year-old seal joke about him not having a dragon? It's obvious that he's still insecure and compensating for something, which is likely why he feels like he has to chase Luke at the end of the season. You also have to take into account that Aemon's logic is based off of bullying. Most people at some point have been bullied. This is different and more personal than other faults of logic we see in villains. I'm going to relate to bullying more than I relate to wanting to genocide half the universe for resource consumption. At that, I want to jump to the last section of the video, which is discussing why I think Aemon killing Luke is a great change for his character. The first point I'm going to get at is that this change fleshes out Aemon a lot. What I mean by that is it would be a lot less interesting and more boring if Aemon just wanted to kill Luke. It's more intriguing that he wanted to intimidate him and he just accidentally ends up killing him. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still his fault for Luke's death. He was being extremely irresponsible, but but it makes a lot more sense that it would happen this way. More tragic as well, since this intimidation was commonplace amongst the boys in their earlier years. Maybe not on this large of a scale, but still. I've seen people criticize the scene and say that it takes away the impact and or Aemond's autonomy when hunting down Luke, and I just don't agree. If this happened in the real world, this would be like manslaughter. Like, yeah, sure, you don't go drunk driving expecting to kill somebody, but making the decision of drunk driving is bad enough on its own. Yeah, Aemond doesn't know if Vhagar would act the way he did, but that doesn't really matter. Besides that, this scene is really good at showing one or two things. One being that Aemond actually cares about his nephew since his haunting look at the end of the season, which is interesting to me because he hasn't shown love for him throughout this whole show. Or two, he just simply cares about his reputation in this moment and or going against his mother. Remember that people will call him a kinslayer once they find out about this. Both of these options are interesting to me because Aemond doesn't really seem to care about either of them throughout the course of the show. He always walks around and acts like a cool guy, but for him to ultimately care about Luke or how other people perceive him is a new layer for his character that he just didn't have before. Also, once he gets it back to King's Landing, it can play out one of two ways. Either he can own up to the kinslayer name, or he could try to explain that it was an accident. Whichever option he chooses will tell us a lot about his character in further seasons. If he goes with the kinslayer name, we could see a Jaime-like route where he's extremely hurt that he lost his honor, but he's hiding behind a persona. And of course, the other route, him attempting to explain that was an accident, seems to indicate that he did care about Luke, or in some capacity, he at least knew that what he did was wrong. Either way could be pretty interesting, and I'd want to see what would happen for the setup in season 2. I hope you guys like this breakdown, and I'll see you next week. See ya.
While we all like us some Rhaenyra, is she really the feminist icon some people are preaching her up to be? This is unironically a pretty important question to consider. The big reason why it feels kind of wrong to be Team Green is because Alicent tries extremely hard to uphold the status quo. Now, I'm not saying the show is playing off a feminist or even a political angle itself. I see it as a whole more like a drama full of selfish people doing selfish things, not necessarily to drive home any political point, but Alicent is different. You could tell she's been politically manipulated by Viserys and her father and layers to the point where I think her actions are strongly influenced by the society she lives in on a subconscious level. Alicent supports a system that's abused her for her whole life. She degrades herself pretty consistently so she can get secrets from Laird to bolster the Greens. To say that she's only doing self-serving things wouldn't be correct. Even when she was younger, she did her duty for the realm and had multiple kids by Viserys when she obviously wasn't comfortable in being with this old man in the first place, let alone sit in a tower and essentially be a baby making machine, which is exactly what she didn't want to do. Compare this to Rhaenyra, where she gets to have an affair with Harwin, fuck around with Daemon, and Sir Christian. I'm not even saying it's wrong for Rhaenyra to do these things, but to claim that Alicent's actions are in the interest of some bigger biased political system doesn't seem right to me, especially in comparison to other characters. But this is also why it seems wrong to root for her. She's supporting a system that's obviously wrong and antithetical to her very existence. Why would you rather root for her as to someone who opposes that same system instead? It seems very natural that Rhaenyra would be the foil to Alicent and how they view the society that they live in. One has been so manipulated by it that they actively support it even when it's not beneficial for them, while the other actively opposes it and actually has the willpower and means to carry it out. But like many things, it's not that simple. There's a pretty big problem and misconception with thinking this way in regards to what we see in the show. Rhaenyra doesn't care about feminist ideals or bringing equality or really any of that. While yes, it's cute to think that Rhaenyra is this hero for women's rights and Alicent's bad and evil, this is all just black and white thinking. Don't get me wrong, Alicent is bad, but so is Rhaenyra, and in the books it's even worse. Not once do we hear about her talking about policy to improve women's rights or bolstering equality. The only justification she gives for why she should rule is simply because it's her birthright. She never gives any indication that she cares for rights or equality as much as any other king, and she even lies and kills people to attain the power she's promised. That isn't really screaming that she's a paragon of justice and equality. Although you can argue that Rhaenyra is risking her life to rule the Iron Throne is enough reason to support her, since she would be somewhat paving the way for other women in this universe. I still wouldn't think that she should deserve any credit for this, simply because her paving the way is just a byproduct of her being power hungry like almost every other king in existence. This is the real fun part because I'm going to break down Rhaenyra's morals even further. A good question to ask is Rhaenyra on the right side of things? Most people feel like the blacks are in the right, and the show definitely frames it this way, especially in regards to what I said about Alicent earlier. And much like how people romanticize Daemon, who's a terrible person, they're doing the same thing to Rhae. Now, the first morally questionable thing she does is seduce Sir Christian. Imagine if your boss, who you've never had any sexual acts with, tried to randomly have sex with you one night, and even after you obviously show you didn't want to do it, they just keep on trying to have sex with you. But imagine now that instead of your boss, it's like the president. Essentially, what's happening here? Sir Christian's ability to consent is extremely impaired in this situation, and he gave an oath that Rhaenyra is definitely aware of. Obviously, him breaking that not only puts his physical well-being in danger, but his mental well-being as well, because after this, the dude just goes nuts. Surprisingly enough, this is one of the minor things that she's done. Now, I don't fault Rhae for having a thing with Harwin, or whatever you want to call it. She told Rhaenyra the plan, he agreed to it, but what I don't think is okay is her having bastards. She's bringing 3 kids into the world that she knows will get bullied and made fun of, or even worse, and all this is done. Why? Like, Rhaenyra could have picked any other Valyrian looking dude that would give her kids white hair at the very least, but now she just says fuck it, and her kids get bullied because of it, and it definitely helped lead to Luke's death. Her kids obviously didn't deserve this, and this is also ignoring the fact that she lies about them being bastards. It'd be different if she argued that them being bastards didn't matter, or she advocated for bastards' rights, but she just straight up lies. If someone implies that she knew that it was wrong, and she even has Daemon killed for literally telling the truth, at least in the books. Speaking of Valyrians, she has Daemon kill a random dude so that they can frame Laenor's death so that they can get married. In the books, it's likely that Daemon and Rhaenyra just straight up planned his death and killed him, but nonetheless, they still kill an innocent man just so they can get married in either case. And that's why it's kind of bizarre to me when some people act like these characters are spotless. I'm not trying to shit on Rhaenyra, but we can't act like she doesn't act selfish or she wants to do what's best for the realm. Trust me, the Greens, they'll get their own video soon enough. But the worst thing Rhaenyra's probably done is just go to war. Remember, the only reason why Rhaenyra feels justified in ruling the Iron Throne is simply because it's her birthright. So she's justifying killing probably millions of people just because she feels like it's her right to rule. Now, I understand that she wanted to talk it out first and Luke being murdered escalated things, but if she hadn't had sex with Sir Christian or had bastard sons in the first place, then the war probably wouldn't even be happening. Really, if anything, her bad actions are what leads to all this happening, which is just her making another bad action, but this time it affects a multitude of different people. All of this is obviously problematic, which is fine. Our characters don't have to be saints, not even our main protagonist, but acting as if she didn't do anything wrong or she's a paragon of good is problematic as well. Ironically, all that being said, I'm still for Team Black. Each side will get their pros and cons videos, because I do think the Greens have an argument. It's going to be interesting to see how people react to season 2. Look at how people reacted to Daemon choking Rhae, and this is a character who's already established to be a horrible person. Sure, he's great, but are you surprised that the dude who mutilates townspeople for fun would choke his wife? Now imagine what's going to happen when Rhaenyra does something really bad or immoral to the Greens, or anyone else on the black side. I think a big thing is that people are used to protagonists being good people. Even in the Game of Thrones TV series, Tyrion, Jon Snow, Ned, Dany, Bran, Arya, all these guys are portrayed as protagonists and they don't really do anything super bad until the show fell apart, but still. Sure, they made bad mistakes and they falter, but they don't do things that would make us say that they're bad people. For example, in the books, Tyrion rapes people and he becomes super bitter. Bran just skin changes into Hodor's body, even when he obviously doesn't want him to. Like, imagine if Tyrion, instead of just talking to that one sex worker, he just raped her. It'd be pretty jarring. And while yes, there are a lot of great characters in the show, I feel like none of them are really portrayed as protagonists. The only character I feel like comes close to this is Jaime. The quote-unquote bad thing he does is kill a king that was genocidal, and he obviously needed to be killed. House of the Dragon is somewhat different in this aspect. Our protagonist, Rhaenyra, does a lot of great things, and it's not just because she's incompetent, it's obviously shown on purpose. And that might be a reason as to why people are overlooking her faults. How all this progresses into season 2, we'll just have to see. If you like this video, then you should subscribe. I'm making a couple of Greens vs Black videos, so if you like this one, you'll definitely like those. Alright, see ya. House of the Dragon has been a surprise for a lot of us, and we're already waiting for season 2. Today, we're going to talk about Aemond Targaryen and why he works in the show. setting up a character. The first scene we get with Daemon, although screaming creepy uncle vibes, it does say a lot about his character. Daemon is shown sitting on the king's throne, which is pretty fucking crazy to do. And the dude just came back to visit. Remember, you can be killed for sitting on the throne if you're not the king. Without doing much, the show has already told us that Daemon doesn't really care about what other characters think about him or even their politics. It also shows that he's willing to take risks and he has a certain confidence towards him. He pretty much just shows up because he's confident that he's going to be Viserys' heir, even though Viserys is having another kid. This perfectly fits into the show don't tell aspect of storytelling, where instead of characters saying Daemon is cool or this and that, we're shown that this is what he is as soon as he's introduced. Also, you'll find that all the other characters around him react to what he's doing instead of the other way around. This makes him feel like a driver in the plot, either when that's them reacting to him sitting on the throne, or the scene where the council is talking about what to do with them after he uses the golden cloaks to make an example out of criminals. It's constantly feeling like he's making his own moves, which definitely gives his character a sense of urgency. I mean, he literally goes to Dragonstone against the king's orders and steals a dragon egg while trying to marry a lowborn while he's married to Lady Rhea. I'm sure some of you like that aspect of his character alone. The fact that he's very unpredictable and pretty much anything he does is gonna have major consequences towards the plot. This also helps make the story feel weighty and have consequences. Character connections. A huge part of what can make a character work is how well they mesh with other characters in the show or movie. Daemon being a main character is pretty much in the center of this. Viserys have fucked up multiple times by welcoming his brother back and he's constantly paying the price for it. Although it never feels cheap when Daemon's allowed back because it's satisfying to see him drive the plot like we said earlier, but also gives insight into both Viserys and Daemon's minds. You really do get the sense that they love each other. Later in the series it becomes a little bit more obvious, but I personally like the more subtle details earlier in the season. At first we know nothing about Daemon, and if you take his actions at face value, it almost seems like he hates the king. He constantly insults him and berates him, and honestly, he just makes his life a pain in the ass. But yet in scenes with the sea snake, he tells him not to insult his brother. And in the first episode, Daemon is really the only one to call Viserys out on being weak. Otto and the rest of the council really are just trying to take advantage of him. They even talk back to Viserys and he doesn't do anything. A lot of the times, Viserys doesn't really even seem like a king, and Daemon knows that he can get away with all the stuff without any punishment either. He literally nicknames Viserys' dead son and heir for a day, literally just to fuck with him. So while yes, you can interpret this as Daemon trying to coerce or trick Viserys into naming him his hand or his heir, in reality he's just saying what's true about his brother. He's trying to help him. You could tell Viserys is probably holding on to childhood moments of his brother, seeing as how he brings up their mother Alyssa when Daemon comes back from the Stepstones. And in reality, Viserys is blinded by stale memories of his old family, which leads him to letting his brother back every time. This is a neat time because it shows that they each have a soft spot for each other, and Daemon brings out a lighter side in Viserys, which is why it's so satisfying when he picks up his crown later in that season. And of course, there is his relationship with Rhaenyra. Although the relationship was surprising to me, I've yet to read the books, so there you go. But it seems like she looked up to Daemon and she was definitely interested in him from the start. At least in the show, we don't know if Daemon was interested in Rhaenyra the whole time or only after he attempted sex with her. But their marriage does show growth in Daemon's character later in the season. At the start of the show, Daemon was really only interested in being on the throne. This is pretty obvious. But then after the time skip, Daemon is shown to not really be interested in politics at all. He'd rather stay cooped up in Pentos. And after he comes back to King's Landing, you might think that he still wants the crown. But in the scene where he crowns Rhaenyra, we see that he has lost the need or want for it. When Sir Ara gives Daemon the crown, I've seen some people say it's Daemon lusting for power or he wants it for himself. But I see it as him being in shock that Arg was even able to get the crown in the first place, but I also think it's him remembering his brother and grieving for him instead of being filled with a need for power like before. This simply just isn't the same character at the start of the show. The story paces it nicely and gradually shows how and why Daemon slows down his selfishness. Don't get me wrong though, he's still not a good guy. He chokes out his wife and kills a random dude just so him and Rhaenyra can get married. But those are just some of the main characters in the plot. Let's look at some of the other side characters that can tell us more about him. Although Laena isn't given much, she's still a pretty cool character, and she does tell us that Daemon is at his best when he's tied in with his Valyrian roots. She sees that Daemon isn't really happy, and this is because he's on land far away and not with his people. Daemon and Laena's daughter Baela has a dragon, which causes Daemon to spend more time with her and leaving his other daughter Rhaena feeling left out. This is obviously Daemon trying to connect to his Valyrian culture, which is also supported by him always reading Valyrian books and stories. Aemond looks up to him. This is shown when after Daemon cuts off Vaemon's head, after Aemond almost looks impressed at his ruthlessness. It's obvious at the very least he respects Daemon, which is also shown after he stops fighting at the dinner with his family. So I think it's pretty obvious that Daemon's pretty important for a lot of the characters. Not only do his actions have consequences, but usually a lot of characters are affected by them. But now let's see just how deep his character is. layers. So at the surface, we've already established that Daemon is a badass who wants the crown and will do and say despicable things for glory and to further his goals. But this doesn't seem different from a lot of characters, so what makes us care? Well, first off, we covered earlier, Daemon won't do anything for the crown because he loves his family. He never tries to kill or assassinate his brother, and when Rhaenyra literally gives him the option of killing her, he just doesn't do it. This makes him understandable and relatable. Yeah, sure, he still does terrible shit and he wants power, but he still has a soft spot. And a lot of the time when he does do bad shit, it's understandable, at least in regards to the story. Understanding why a character does bad things is crucial for having interesting plot developments. For instance, it's hard to understand why Daenerys burned down all of King's Landing and innocent people. I can't look from her perspective and relate to why she would do that, but I can see and understand why Tyrion would kill his father. In both cases, these characters do things that you could consider to be wrong, but one situation is a lot more interesting because I could put myself in Tyrion's shoes. You don't always need your villain to be understandable. Sometimes you just need something for the good guys to root against, but if you want an interesting or relatable character, they have to be somewhat gray. I understand why Daemon went and punished criminals using his golden cloaks. I can understand why he talked shit to his brother and Otto, although they probably don't deserve it. This helps make him feel like a real person. Also, another very solid part of the show is that Daemon is impotent, meaning he has problems getting it up. On the surface, we have a very masculine, over-the-top type of guy, imposing his will on other people, but this expectation of macho-ness turned on its head by making him impotent. It makes him deeper than just a caricature. There's also multiple different ways you can interpret this layer of him. Not being able to finish can be seen as a moral failure, like when Daemon walks out on Rhaenyra, he realizes what he's doing is wrong, or at the very least somewhat weird, so he can't get it up, and this disgust is what leads him to get drunk or try to forget what he did. It could be simply just a symbolization of his character in general. Daemon always is wanting more. He has all this pent-up energy, but he can never quite get the satisfaction he's aiming for. He aims for glory and the stepping stones, but gets pissed because his brother has to help him. He gets married to a house he thinks is boring and he really doesn't care about it at all. He wants to be king, but he simply has no chance of being one since the way he was born. Not only is he born the king's brother, which makes his claim weak, but he's born impulsive, brash, and violent. Another interpretation the show goes with is his impotence could also be a side effect of his appreciation for Valyrian culture. After Daemon fails to finish, Mysaria tells him that she could bring in someone with silver hair. Also, Rhea says that their marriage was never consummated. Whatever the reason is, it subverts her expectations in a good way. And another layer to Daemon's character is his political intelligence. A huge part of Game of Thrones was the political intrigue of the whole show. Characters who make smart moves, live longer, and are generally more liked. It seems like House of the Dragon is no different. At multiple points, Daemon shows that he has this intelligence in subtle ways you may not have noticed. In episode 4, it's pretty likely that Daemon takes Rhaenyra to the pleasure house just so that he has a better chance to marry her. If Rhaenyra has sex before she's married, that's a lot less likely that other lords will want her. This could lead to Daemon being the only decent option for Rhaenyra, and since Rhaenyra is heir, this will thus increase his power. Another interesting thing he does is that after killing his wife Rhea, he's confronted by her cousin, where he rightly accuses Daemon of murder. To shut him up, Daemon brings up the fact that he has the right to Runestone. While it's a small moment and hasn't come up again, it definitely makes Daemon feel competent when it comes to politics. Not to mention that in this same wedding, he starts making moves with Lyanna, who at this point has the biggest dragon, so there's multiple power moves going on in play. And while him going to find the stepping stones is more of an honor grab than anything, it was what allowed him to come back to King's Landing to try and marry Rhaenyra in the first place. All in all, I think Hot Dia's done a really good job of representing and fleshing out characters from Fire and Blood. Also, I'll probably do more character breakdowns in the future, so if you like this video, subscribe. See ya. If you like this guy, stay tuned, because in this video we're going to explain why and how these scenes make him so great. Character setup. The first scene opens with Viserys being crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms and over his cousin Rhaenys. This firmly establishes the main conflict of the whole show, following tradition. A huge theme we see in Targaryen-focused stories is breaking the wheel.
I'm going to break the wheel.
Dany is seemingly always talking about it, and Rhaenyra, our main character in House of the Dragon, is focused on changing the traditions of her house. In the books, Rhaenys isn't even really an option for the throne in the first place. Instead, it's her son Laenor. So it's apparent that in House of the Dragon, they're putting an emphasis on the theme that women can't rule by shoving it right in your face. Thus, Viserys' main conflict is should he keep the tradition that has helped to keep his house powerful for over 100 years, or honor his wife and daughter by making Rhaenyra heir to the throne. Early in the series, we see Viserys struggling mightily with this idea. At first, he doesn't even consider naming an heir until his son is born, and he's pretty insistent on having one. So insistent that he's wanting to have his wife's belly cut open. It's obvious that him having a male heir is important to him because he deeply cared about Emma. He knew that it was risky for her to keep getting pregnant, but this is just another instance of the pressure of tradition negatively affecting our character's choices, because after Aemond dies, he abandons this whole idea entirely. Obviously, he ends up naming Rhaenyra his heir, despite everyone around him telling him not to, but this ends up tearing him apart. His friends on the council undermine his decision and actively plot against his will, and his mental state deteriorates rapidly because of the stress of the whole situation. For example, in episode 3, he brings up a dream he had about a son of his being crowned king, probably Aegon. It's what leads to him wanting a son so badly from Emma, and eventually her death, and he hates this about himself. The fact is that he wanted to chase his abstract verification of his rule so harshly that he would kill his wife for it. Naming Rhaenyra heir was an attempt to alleviate Viserys' guilt and regret, but obviously this has a serious number of downsides which makes his character conflict so interesting. But all this is mainly in the start of the season. Later, Viserys is firm in his choices, but this time, that same choice is now tearing his family apart. After the 10-year time skip is shown to us that the greens and blacks are starting to form. This is all happening under Viserys' nose, and the main fuel for this conflict is that Rhaenyra is heir. If she sits on the Iron Throne, then the greens' main fear is that Westeros is going to revolt, or that she'll just kill Aegon and the rest of Alicent's family. While Viserys has definitely heard the argument that Westeros won't accept a female ruler, he does seem ignorant to the idea that Rhaenyra would just execute all the greens. In his mind, she would never do such a thing, but to the greens, it does kind of make sense. Rhaenyra is pretty quick to lie about having sex in the 4th episode, and also lie about her children not being bastards. This deceit kind of justifies to the greens that Rhaenyra was willing to do anything for her claim. Viserys, being none the wiser, doesn't address this or do anything about the rivalry starting between his family. It's made even more tragic by the fact that he's happily ignorant about the whole situation. Deep down, he probably knows something is wrong, but he's just choosing not to acknowledge the fact, as decisions have led to more family division. This is what I mean by him being a tragic character. He makes his daughter heir to honor his dead wife, who's dead because of him, but in doing this, he actively creates even more division between his family, even starting the whole Dance of the Dragons, which has crippled the Targaryen dynasty for pretty much the rest of its existence. I mean, look at just the personal turmoil Viserys went through just because he named his daughter heir. But I think the next good question to ask about his character was if he was a good ruler or not. The thing with Viserys is that there's a lot of gray. Yeah, sure, he was progressive and named his daughter heir to the throne, but the way he went about it was just terrible. This summarizes his reign as a whole pretty nicely though. Although Westeros was peaceful during the time he ruled, Viserys was quoted to be a pretty weak king.
You're weak, Viserys.
Aemond calls him weak, the council speaks over him multiple times, Corlys essentially calls him weak in front of his brother's face, and he's generally criticized to not take action. For instance, he waits years to take action in the Stepstones even though Corlys' power is being crippled. So it's not really clear if Viserys was a good ruler or not, even though he had good intentions and the realm was peaceful. But one thing is clear though is that he's trying. We could see and understand the struggle he's going through to try to be a good ruler. I mean, the throne is literally killing him. You see how much his health deteriorated over the years, yet he never really complains about his role, and when Rhaenyra asks him to dismiss Otto as hand, he does it. Family needs him the most, he organizes a dinner to try and make things right, and he doesn't take milk of the poppy so that he could think rationally. It's extremely easy to relate to someone who's just trying their best at something that still doesn't seem to work out. But while we're on the topic of the family dinner, I think we should dive into his character connections. I think the most interesting connection Viserys has is with his brother Daemon. I covered that in Daemon's video, so check it out if you haven't already. But the next obvious one is Rhaenyra. The relationship is rocky to say the least, and Viserys doesn't really let her talk in court even after naming her heir, and he also doesn't really put any safety precautions in place to secure her role if he were to die suddenly. But remember, the main reason Viserys named her heir was to honor Emma. This signals to us that Rhaenyra reminds Viserys of his wife, and she's one of the only things he has left of her. Probably the reason why he's so lenient with her. And we've seen Viserys have this problem before with remembering past memories and past family members and having it cloud his judgment, because just like with Daemon, he likes the old memories he has with them and his old family, which is why he's so lenient with them and allows him to come back and even asks him to come back on a couple occasions. I think the main point of Rhaenyra's and Viserys' relationship is to signify to us how much Viserys regrets trying for another child with Emma. It's shown even when Viserys is dying, he's still thinking about her, and like we went over in episode 3, he has this huge pit of grief inside of him that he's constantly trying to reduce. Most of this is channeled through Rhae. Another interesting relationship Viserys has is with Otto. I don't see many people talking about it, but it's still intriguing nonetheless. After the strong assassination in Harrenhal, we see Otto actually being brought back as the Hand off screen. But why would Viserys want Otto back? He could literally just name anyone else Hand if he wanted to. It's likely that Alicent greatly influenced Viserys to bring Otto back, which signals the power dynamics in the relationship. And it's pretty obvious that this was the plan for Otto the whole time. Obviously, he probably didn't want to leave King's Landing in the first place, but you can't say his manipulation of Viserys by using his daughter didn't work. And this is also where we get into the greatness of Otto's character. Sitting allowing his daughter to manipulate Viserys seems pretty wrong to do, along with how he plans against him after his death. There's a reason for all this. Otto wants to benefit the realm. The reason why he advocates for Aegon so much is so Westeros doesn't revolt into chaos. Is it moral to do bad things to benefit the overall population? Or even better, does your intentions change the morality of an action? In this way, Otto is fundamentally the opposite of Viserys. Viserys' actions are mostly fueled by his personal desires or just to right his wrongs, while Otto is just doing what he sees as what's best for the people, although it may be warped and distorted. You can even argue that Otto sending Alicent to Viserys was a ploy to make him have another child. What makes their relationship even more tragic is that Otto seemed to actually care about Viserys and vice versa. But now that we've gotten key characters out of the way, let's move on and discuss how many layers Viserys has as a character. Layers. So at the surface, we have a benevolent king who is able to avoid war and treat all his subjects kindly. Without looking any deeper, we see that Viserys seems to be a pretty good guy, but his kindness is a double-edged sword. While yes, the realm has been peaceful under his rule, that same kindness is what allowed the Dance of the Dragons to happen in the first place. Yes, Viserys listens to his court and he's progressive, but this is why the court discusses plans behind his back. So while yes, we want to empathize with Viserys, is he really a good guy? I mean, being a people pleaser isn't really considered a virtue. Nonetheless, I believe that Viserys' shortcomings is just proof that the king is unforgiving. Kind-hearted men can't really sit the throne. They get taken advantage of and they're too slow to action. You somewhat get the sense that Viserys doesn't even want the burden in the first place. Even in his first scene when he's announced king, he doesn't seem all that happy, and it's symbolized through all the cuts he gets on the throne that the power isn't doing him any favors. Viserys even seems like someone of an oddball in regards to his own family. He says that the control over dragons is just an illusion. Most Targaryens don't really think this way, and while what he says may be true, his family sure doesn't seem to think the same. Also, Viserys doesn't ride dragons. After Balerion died, Viserys didn't bond with another dragon. And while yes, it's never been shown that a Targaryen has bonded with multiple dragons, it seems more like Viserys just didn't even try to bond with another one. I mean, why wouldn't he at least try? Balerion died when Viserys was relatively young, but that's just speculation. Point is, Viserys is cut from a different cloth, for better or for worse. He doesn't enjoy power and holds a completely different ideology towards dragons, at least in the show. No other Targaryens act like this, and this semi-odd behavior can help explain the results of his rule. A rule that was a peaceful one, but still somehow managed to spawn one of the most damaging conflicts, if not the most damaging, to all of House Targaryen. But like many other characters and things in Game of Thrones, the situation is a great one. It'd be foolish to say that Viserys had a bad reign or that he was a bad man, so we'll just have to speculate and wonder just what type of man Viserys Targaryen really was. If you liked this video, then subscribe. I plan on making a video per week, so it shouldn't be too hard to keep up with uploads. Okay, see ya. In House of the Dragon, Alicent consistently gets the short end of the stick as more of a victim than a villain, and in this video, I'm gonna prove that. Disliking Rhae is justified. This is a deep dive from the topic in my last video, but something that didn't come up was that Alicent is justified in not liking Rhaenyra. If her reasons for not liking her are justified, then her actions against her are more rational because Rhaenyra would be an actual threat. As we'll get into later, Alicent was manipulated by Otto to believe that duty is extremely valuable, and this is supported by the general society that they live in. Sir Christian's sense of duty helped ruin his whole life, and you can say the same thing to Viserys, who probably didn't really want to be king in the first place. So when Rhaenyra breaks her duty and has sex with Sir Christian, it was obviously a big deal for Alicent. We never see Alicent go out into flea bottom or have fun with other guys. You could definitely argue that the whole sense of duty thing in this world is dumb, which I would agree with you, but when understanding character modes, we have to look at it through their eyes and that society's lens. So it's completely reasonable to see why Alicent would be disappointed when this was drilled in her head so thoroughly. The nail in the coffin was when Rhae lied to Alicent. Prior to this, they were best friends, and lying about this would be a pretty big deal. I've seen some people try to argue that Rhae didn't lie to Alicent because she specifically asked her if she did anything with Daemon. Well, this obviously isn't true. She still did stuff with Daemon, so it doesn't matter anyway. Even if Alicent asked her if she had sex with Sir Christian specifically, she'd probably still lie about it. This undoubtedly conjured trust issues between the two, which can be seen when Rhae proposes that Jason and Helena get married. Alicent is very dismissive of this and wants to know Rhaenyra's true motives, when in reality the motives for the proposal were probably genuine. Also, not mentioning that Rhae lying got Otto dismissed his hand. This is glossed over, but it's a pretty big deal since this means that Alicent probably didn't see Otto for years after this point, and it also likely added to the mistrust and overall antagonizing towards Rhaenyra. But the climax in all of these problems are Rhaenyra's children. Alicent had to stay with this old sick man for a large chunk of her life and was forced to have his kids, so seeing Rhaenyra mess around with multiple other people definitely doesn't seem fair to her, especially when you consider the fact that Rhaenyra is heir to the throne and should have more responsibilities and or duties than Alicent. This explains her hostility
infertility and demandingness to see her newborn in episode 6. The bastards pretty much sum up all the reasons Alicent has to dislike her ex-best friend, and their birth just justified to Alicent why she should be against the Blacks. In this section, we're going to focus on Viserys and specifically how bad of a father he is. This can be credited towards Viserys being a bad king as well, but he plays multiple roles in making Alicent's life harder than it has to be. The first big problem is that he ignores his children. This definitely aided in his kids turning out so badly, especially when you consider that Aegon's whole problem is that he feels ignored and unloved since Viserys pretty much just ignores him since Rhaenyra is his heir. This leads to Alicent having to do damage control to try to reprimand his actions. For instance, she has to give Diana moon tea and discipline Aegon, which it's implied that this has happened before. While Alicent isn't blameless in the different types of abuse her and children endure, there's no question that Viserys doing this made her life much harder than it had to be. And the fact that she's in a forced marriage makes this a lot worse. Speaking of Alicent's kids, remember that scene where Viserys doesn't punish Luke or Jace for cutting out Aemond's eye? This seems to be pretty representative of his role. He never really defends his wife or children and at multiple points talks about Aemond in front of Alicent's face. You would think Viserys would provide his kids and wife some form of priority, but he just doesn't, leading Alicent to have this us versus them mindset against Rhaenyra, especially since Rhae can do whatever she wants without consequences. With this in mind, you can definitely understand Alicent's bitterness towards the whole situation, since her own husband won't even stand up for her. He openly talks about his ex-wife, which died because of him, and added in the fact that he ignores her problems and needs. The only time Viserys recognizes Alicent is when she's taking care of him, and when you factor in that Viserys was the king and his word is law, that means that having his support will go a very long way. My last problem with Viserys in reference to this video is him taking advantage of Alicent. Besides Viserys making Alicent his caretaker, the thing that's not talked about enough in regards to him is the marital rape. Viserys orders Alicent to his room and has sex with her, although she's obviously not interested. When Aegon is seen as terrible because he rapes people, this doesn't make sense to me as to why this isn't addressed. Alicent was already shown to likely have anxiety problems since the show puts an emphasis on how much she picks her fingers, and she does it in this sex scene as well. It'd obviously be redundant to state the amount of trauma this would cause, but it does reinforce the idea that her sense of duty is being manipulated or warped, since she probably felt obligated to have sex acts with Viserys since she is his wife. No other character in the show really has this problem, or at the least it's not shown explicitly in the show, adding to Alicent's victimization. The biggest argument for Alicent being a victim is all the manipulation that goes on in the show, especially at the start where she's essentially a pawn and has no autonomy in how her life plays out. There's three main characters that victimize Alicent the most, so let's get into them. We can't talk about Alicent without talking about Otto. It seems like from birth, Alicent was destined to be Otto's pawn. Let's assume that Otto's motives are to gain more power and get his kids on the throne, which is evident throughout the show since she pushes Alicent to marry Viserys so hard. Pretty much all of Alicent's and Otto's interactions is him leading her to gain power, whether that's through Viserys or discrediting Rhaenyra. And the scene of Otto leaving, he tells her that Rhaenyra will likely kill her children if she ever has the throne. There's no evidence of Rhae being this cruel to anyone at this point. Well, yes, she did lie and have sex with her Christian. That's a big jump to murdering children. But Otto succeeds and gets Alicent to believe the lie, which is what leads her to push Aegon to be king in the first place, which is evident in this scene. In other scenes, Otto tells her to wear a nice dress so Viserys will open up to her more. And after Alicent stabs Rhae, Otto tries to take advantage of her, saying that he didn't know she had a dark side. All of this does make a lot of sense though from Otto's perspective, since Alicent had multiple male siblings and she wasn't even a firstborn, so Otto would definitely see her as expendable. Of course, next we have to talk about Larys. I found Larys to be a very interesting character. The way he manipulates Alicent is he gets her hands dirty. When she complains about the other strongs, he kills them and acts as if she wanted it, which ropes her into the deed. Now that her hands are dirty and she's seen what Larys can do, she has to go back to him for help, or her kids might die if Rhaenyra gets the upper hand, or at least that's what she thinks. And at that point, it becomes extremely easy for Larys to exploit Alicent's need to protect her children, to the point where she'll even degrade herself pretty extensively just for information. Well, yes, you could argue that's Alicent's fault for dealing with Larys in the first place. You have to remember that A, Larys groomed Alicent as a child, and B, from Alicent's perspective, she has to do this to protect her kids. Any info against Rhaenyra could be life-saving. It's hard to fault Alicent for thinking this way because, like we discussed earlier, Otto groomed Alicent from an early age to be against Rhaenyra. Most people in this situation would turn out this way. The last person I'm going to reference is, again, Viserys. Well, I'm not going to say much since a lot of it was already said in the Viserys section. There is something to be said about how dismissive he is towards her concerns. Whenever Alicent has a concern about Rhaenyra or something else, Viserys downplays it even when he knows it's not correct. This can definitely be chalked up to a form of manipulation. Like after Alicent checked on Joffrey and Viserys told her that nature works in mysterious ways. This is obviously just a downplay. Viserys knows these kids are bastards. He's just disregarding Alicent's feelings, and this happens throughout the rest of the series. All in all, I think Alicent is a more tragic character than anything else. else. And while this video isn't giving her a pass for her actions, I think it would be beneficial to actually look into why she does the things she does. If you like this video, then give it a like or subscribe. I consistently make content like this weekly, so join my community, and in the meantime, watch this video. See ya.
Have you ever wondered how House of the Dragon could be better? In this video, I'm going to explain what this show needs and why. Let's get to the most important thing in the show. Dragons. Obviously, they're important, but not for the reasons you might think of at first. Dragons need more attention in the show. As it stands, the only reason I care about them is because they're essentially a living nuke, and they're just this super cool piece of fiction. But I don't want to just like something because it's cool. I want an emotional attachment to it. And as it stands right now, it seems like the show isn't really interested in doing that, which is pretty bizarre to me. The dragons' personalities are there, and especially in the books. For instance, Caraxes is supposed to be extremely fierce, but I don't really get that sense in the show. I would describe all the dragons as fierce, but if I only watched the show, I wouldn't be able to differentiate Caraxes by his personality. And while Vhagar does seem old and sleepy, I want more in terms of uniqueness and quirkiness that would make the dragons feel more different besides just their appearance and size. And the dragons obviously shouldn't feel all the same anyway. They're magical wild animals that are surprisingly intelligent. Think about it, there's going to be a lot of battles in the show, and while we care emotionally about the characters, think how much better it'd be if we felt the same about the dragons as well. It would make it way more interesting and suspenseful to watch fights that go out this way. And a lot of people are going to be turned off from the CGI battles as well, and this will help quell that. I am going to address the elephant or elephants in the room when it comes to this topic though. And one of those is that we do get scenes showing dragon personality. One of them being when Rhaenyra wants death by dragon fire. Vhagar doesn't really want to do it, and she's confused by it. This scene would have been way worse if Vhagar just mechanically decided to burn her right away. And I really like this scene, but I need more of it. And this is definitely an example of dragon personality done right. The other thing I was gonna bring up was Luke's death. Ultimately, it's shown that dragons aren't slaves and they can do what they want. This is definitely interesting, especially from the implication it has on future battles, since this isn't really a development in the books. But the problem here is that it doesn't make me care about the dragons more. It seems like they put this in the show to make things unpredictable and make the Targaryen control over dragons more realistic. In Game of Thrones, Daenerys rarely doesn't have control over dragons, especially when she's riding them, except on a few occasions. But in the books, her dragons essentially do what they want. It's a lot more like the dragons just let Daenerys ride them than anything else. So while I think it's a good addition to the show, it still overall doesn't solve my first issue. And look what happens when you get bonding moments. Aemond bonding with Vhagar is one of the best moments in the series, and more moments like that, even with writers doing casual things with their dragons, will go a long way. So the next problem is how the show handles death and or action. A big allure in Game of Thrones is that main characters can die at any moment, especially if they make bad decisions. Obviously that's not here in season 1, and that's okay, but would have probably made the season better. While I have no doubt people are gonna die and the stakes are gonna be raised in later seasons, currently I'm gonna explain why it'd be beneficial if they did take this route. For instance, after Viserys dies, the Greens gather all the lords to get them to swear allegiance to the Greens. Imagine if the Greens just cleared house here. Any lord who wouldn't pledge instantly would just be executed. This would be a lot more exciting and make the situation more dire, and you would have genuinely be concerned for Rhaenys and her escape, and any other character you like getting caught in this instance. This plays a big part into the relationship between choices and consequences. If the biggest consequence is death, then we're not seeing a lot of consequences. Sir Christian hits the future king, kills his lover, and nothing happens to him. Sure, Alicent is most likely protecting him, but still. In the books, he critically injures Joffrey in a tournament just for him to die days later, so it makes sense that he doesn't get punished. Another big problem this creates is the whitewashing of characters. Rhaenyra and Alicent specifically are a lot softer in the show as opposed to the books. While I can understand that they want people to sympathize with these characters, a lot of the times it just doesn't make sense. Like how they don't kill Rhaenys. Rhaenys still has a dragon, Sea Smoke. Dragons can't be claimed or bonded with if they already have riders, so now they have to find some way around that or just retcon it, which probably wouldn't be desirable. Also, would Rhaenys really leave behind the dragon that he loved to ride? Sure, he probably didn't love every aspect of his life, but he probably did like his parents, his dragon obviously, and fighting in battle. Not to mention that his death would be pretty impactful and even a turning point in the story for how serious it's getting. And the whitewashing just makes for awkward writing and character situations. For example, at the family dinner we see the kids of each faction fighting, but not Alicent or Rhaenyra. And it seems like they got along and have reconciled their differences. And this is how it's happened in the books. In our show of Amity, each woman wore the other's color and many declarations of love were made. But in Blood and Fire, as soon as Viserys dies, the Greens start to plot on how they should king Aegon. And Alicent is extremely implicit in crowning her son, which makes sense here because the Greens are ruthless. I can see them acting friendly in front of Viserys just to stab Rhae in the back later on, because they set up the Greens as being less empathetic, which works. But the show wants to present our characters as more understandable and not as selfish, so when they make up at the feast, you're wondering how will this conflict start. So to solve this problem, Viserys brings up the prophecy of ice and fire, and Alicent misunderstands it, which is why she's down to crown Aegon. The problem here is that the show is forced to come up with some coincidence
arguments, misunderstanding to push the story forward. And this could have all just been solved by not whitewashing the characters in the first place. If this one action was likely to start the war, then why do it by coincidence and not just character motivation or choices? Another problem with the action is we haven't seen any battle tactics or how our characters act in these type of high pressure sequences. We see a little bit of this in the stepstones, but ultimately I don't like this scene because it's just Daemon essentially having plot armor. He survives all this arrow fire and kills like 15 dudes before he gets struck down by some arrows. It's just somewhat reminiscent of Game of Thrones season 8 for me. And while it's cool that Daemon surrendered first, and it definitely seemed like something he would do, I think more strategy in these battle sequences would go a long way. The last problem I'm gonna bring up here is the pacing of the show. This is essentially the prologue, so they had to speed through some parts. But what I'm worried about is how they'll handle future time skips later in the story. There's still a lot left to tell. Primarily what I think would be best is to slow down and take extra time to explain the side of the Greens. Aemond specifically has a lot of room for development here. It'd be cool to explore the relationship between him and Daemon, how similar they are to each other. After killing Luke, there's multiple ways to go with this character, and whether he embraces the fact that he's a kinslayer or will he reject and claim it was an accident. As it stands, the show wants us to empathize with the Greens and understand their side. The vast majority of people see them as the villains, which isn't inherently bad, but if they want to frame it like this, then I would definitely want some more screen time with these characters besides Alicent and Otto. These are all the things I would just want to see in season 2. If you like this speculation, check out this playlist. See you.